we've talked about properties that we want to see in our individual information ecosystem sources. And those properties tend to be properties that get inherited by the system as a whole. So an ecosystem with lots of accurate sources tends to be an ecosystem that itself is accurate. An ecosystem with lots of fecund sources is a fecund ecosystem. Some properties, however, are more appropriately thought of in terms of the ecosystem itself, and so we want to look at a few of those. Let's start with scope. You want to have an ecosystem that has an appropriate comprehensiveness, a relatively large scope, larger than probably you might think at first. You'll want to include multiple sources, and you'll want to include a comprehensive array of topics upon which you have multiple sources. And ideally, you would like to have sources from different media. You'd like to have print sources and video sources all on the same topic. And the idea here is this infrastructure is a set of trusted go-to sources. And so you want to have general sources, say like a Wikipedia or an encyclopedia of philosophy and so on, but you also want to have specialized sources, and you want to be able to go to your information ecosystem sources for a wide variety of different information seeking and fact-checking activities. So you really do want to have a relatively large scope, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the sorts of topics that I think are important for people to regularly inform themselves on and hence to have sources on within an information ecosystem. Next is slant. Not surprisingly, your information ecosystem is going to tend to take on the slant that is consistent with your own worldview. So if you're a big sports person, you're probably going to have a lot of sports sources in there. If you like camping, you may have a lot of camping sources in there. If you're a politics junkie, then you may have a lot of politics. If you're conservative, it may be more conservative. If you're liberal, it may be more liberal. If you're apolitical, you may have very few political sources. And that's just natural because it's like uploading apps to modify your phone to make it more personalized to your own needs and uses. But of course, as we noticed when we looked at the personalization algorithms that are coming into effect in social media news feeds and searches and so on, personalization is a double-edged sword. You want to customize your information ecosystem so that you have an easy time finding things that interest you. But you can't limit your information ecosystem, or for that matter, your information seeking and fact-checking, merely to the things that you find interesting or even the things that you agree with. And so I strongly encourage students in this chapter and throughout to also include good sources, fecund, accurate sources that confront your worldview, that are about things that you're not particularly interested in. So I personally am not particularly interested in, say, for instance, financial regulations. Right? But I do, in fact, on a regular basis, inform myself about what's going on in the economy, what's going on with financial regulations, and so on. And I also, on a regular basis, look at articles, videos, things of that nature that are antithetical to my own sort of worldview. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail, why that's important. But the basic idea is that you want to have a counterbalance, a way of avoiding falling into a sort of tyrannical filter bubble. Finally, you want to have a diversity of media. And there are a number of different reasons why you want to have a diversity of media within your information ecosystem. Different media have different timelines that they have for reporting the news. So things like television and newspapers their timeline tends to be relatively short, or at least can be relatively short. So you'll hear about breaking news on the news, or you'll read about it in the newspaper. When you switch over to magazines, that timeline gets a little bit longer. When you switch over to books, that timeline still longer. If you switch over to, say, textbooks, that timeline probably extends even more. The modes of presentation also have their own strengths and weaknesses. So listening to, say, podcasts, or listening to the radio, or NPR as you're driving somewhere, those are all things that you can do without wasting visual attention on them. Video, you have to more or less watch to see what's going on with it. Reading, of course, takes a great deal of concentration, and you have to look at things to read them. So different modes of presentations have different strengths and weaknesses. You may be a more visual person. You may be a more linguistic person. And you'll want to have that mix that reflects your cognitive strengths and weaknesses, or cognitive strengths and dispositions. In addition to that, different media have different editorial standards. So what they consider to be appropriate fact-checking procedures, or what they think you have to do in order to make sure that you've got a comprehensive and compelling account of something. And so by getting a diversity of media, you're getting information that is potentially subject to a diverse set of editorial standards. The final one that I would want to mention that's not on the slide here is ownership. So when someone owns, or some corporation owns, a ton of news stations, as we see more and more frequently in the United States and around the world, what you discover is that there becomes a certain homogeneity, and the world view that's embodied in that corporation and its officers tends to get reflected in the media. There's also less coverage of local news, and there is less chance of news that comes out that is things that the particular large corporation doesn't specialize in or have interest in. And so the consolidation of media, and in fact the cross-consolidation, newspapers and television stations and radio stations all being owned by the same conglomerate, right, arguably has some very serious downsides in terms of the kinds of information that becomes available, the independence of reporters, of TV stations in reporting their news, and the overall competitiveness that encourages both accuracy and fecundity in reporting.